Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. Today is Tuesday, November 5th, 2024, the day we have been waiting for since January 7th, 2021, to make some sense out of how on earth we're going to move forward in this country. The election day, we will have counts starting at 6 p.m. in Florida, and nobody knows what's happening. So I'm John Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary. With me, as always, executive editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
Media commentary columnist Christine Rosen. Hi, Christine.
Hi, John.
Washington commentary columnist Matthew Continetti. Hi, Matt.
Hi, John.
And our senior editor Seth Mandel. Hi, Seth.
Hi, John.
All I can tell you is that both Joe Rogan, who endorsed Trump last night, and Oprah Winfrey, who of course endorsed Kamala Harris months ago and spoke at the convention, and Elon Musk, the richest man in the world, all three of them last night said that if the election doesn't go the way that they want it to, this will be the last time we will ever vote. So we have the richest man in the world, the most successful
From your lips to God's
podcaster,
ears.
the most successful podcaster in the world, and the most legendary broadcaster of our time, also worth $4 billion, informing us that the country that we live in and a constitutional order that has survived for almost 250 years is about to end unless they get what they want. That's not healthy rhetoric.
No, on Morning Joe today, Michael Beschloss, the historian, said that if Trump wins the election, history writing will be outlawed. And
well, could his history writing be outlawed? Because that would be.
Unfortunately, we can't make a law.
It's not that I don't believe that history writing should be outlawed, but I will make exceptions in certain cases. Also, does he even write books anymore? How was the last time?
I don't know the last time he wrote a book.
Anyway,
yeah, maybe 20 years ago.
Anyway, a lot of history writing on campuses should be outlawed. By
my
the way,
point is that the rhetoric
shouldn't be.
I was offering another example of the.
Thank you, but you know,
rhetoric.
We've got a riff here. You know, you got a riff. I mean,
no, they need look. They need a bracing dose.
Could we outlaw Howard Zinn?
They need a bracing dose of Yuval Levin. They need to read Yuval, who's telling everyone in the way that only Yuval can. Calm down. We will continue as a nation. And also, I would add, you know, the local elections are still far more impactful on people's daily lives than whomever is president. I mean, we focus on the presidency, but there are also local elections. People should go and vote and understand that their vote still matters. This rhetoric is just the hyperbole, which draws viewers and attention, it's not healthy, but it's also incorrect in describing how our system works.
But you know what's the problem with Yuval Levin's very calming message? He's not on Twitter, where the message really needs to be heard. Anybody who's reading Yuval is probably thinking straight already. And we could use him in the nut house a bit every once in a while for a visit.
Okay, so let's discuss this question about what will or will not be outlawed in the wake of this election. You know, it will not be outlawed? Anything. Because the most likely result of this election will be divided government, I believe. I believe that should Trump prevail, there's something in the atmosphere that tells me that Democrats will take the House. And if Harris prevails, certainly Republicans will have control of the Senate. And what we will have is a gigantic political stalemate. So not only will nothing be outlawed, nothing will be lawed, at least for a long time.
John, the scenario you lay out is so far from the one that the people who are predicting these sort of nightmare futures for us have in mind. They see this as sci-fi if Trump wins. There's troops coming through the streets. There's batons coming down on heads. There's new tyrannical insignia. You know, it's unbelievable. I have to reassess, because I had said weeks ago that I thought if Trump were to win, liberals would take it maybe a little better than they did in 2016. I'm completely wrong. I'm doing a 180. They will take it much, much worse. That has become very clear to me.
Really? Well, I think there was a shock factor in 2016.
That's what I thought.
That there was a stunned quality, at least for the first couple of months, and people just sort of living through the fact that they had entered into a reality that they could not even begin to imagine. And now, of course, we've not only lived through the reality of a Trump presidency, but we've lived through the reality of the 4 years after the Trump presidency, in which enormous measures were taken to ensure that there would not be a second Trump presidency. Indictments, investigations, the raising of billions of dollars, the sort of the counter reaction to Dobbs, all of that stuff. And if he should prevail tonight, there will be no shock. Right?
There
shock is
there
not
will
going to be.
The shock
You think there'll be shock?
Okay. The shock is liberals can't believe that anyone doesn't see Trump the way they do. They can't. So for them, everyone who's voting for Trump really wants, in his or her core, tyrannical government. They want racism. They want the end of democracy.
Yeah. I think the shock will be felt among liberals toward the American people.
Right.
How dare you do this again after all that's happened? And I thought a very revealing
We went to your diners. We went to your diners. We tried to understand you.
Your mine towns in Appalachia, and wrote books about communities in Louisiana. And we tried to understand you. And here again, you're doing it. And in fact, more of you are doing it if Trump wins, right? More of you are doing it 8 years later. Jamel Bowie in the New York Times today had a very revealing column where he says, look, if you vote for Trump, it means that you're extremists and you hate change and you're exclusive. And I actually think, minus the extremist part, a lot of Trump voters would be like, yeah, so we kind of want the country to not have as many illegal immigrants. And the change that people like Jamel Bowie propose is bad and scary. And so the two sides have this kind of heightened perception of what the other is capable of achieving. And that leads, I think, to some of the rhetoric we've seen in the final days that you mentioned. On the other hand, I thought there was a very good piece written by the writer Richard Vigilante, who he worked for National Review in the 80s. Now he has a Substack that he collaborates with George Gilder sometimes, and I enjoy it quite a bit. And he said, look, if Trump wins, we know what we're going to get, and the resistance will spring into action, and it's just going to be 4 more years of fighting between the two sides. And the scary scenarios that the left are painting will not materialize. And if Harris wins, the truth is that the anti-woke movement is broader than Trump. It's broader than MAGA. In fact, MAGA is kind of, I think, capitalizing on it, which we can see in the response to the ad talking about Kamala is for they, them, Trump is for you, talking about biological men and women's sports, talking about some of the stuff that has been tried to kind of pushed on children in terms of school curricula. So that movement, which you can see in kind of new institutions, a lot of publications on Substack, parents revolting at school board levels, that stuff isn't going to go away. So each candidate will have counter pressures and constraints on them, meaning that the type of change we can expect is not as massive as Oprah may think.
I wonder if, in retrospect, I mean, we'll assess all this, weeks from now. I wonder if this might be the election where it's actually the American suburbs that get radicalized, because all of those things that Matt is talking about, many of them, the battlegrounds, were not in the cities, in DC, in, centers of federal or urban power. They were all happening in the suburbs. And it reminds me of something John has said since COVID, which is that we won't see these downstream effects from the pandemic for many, many years. And I wonder if this election will show that movement of people out of cities after COVID. Remember, a lot of people fled the cities. They went into suburbs from those urban cores. A lot of those people were Democratic voters, and some of them tried to change the suburbs to make it look more Democratic. And I have friends in Florida who complain about this. They're like, all these people came from up north, and now our red county is turning blue. And there's a lot of conflict right now in the suburbs about the woke issues, but also just about whether the suburbs will remain a kind of typically moderate conservative place. And so I'll be curious to see those sort of suburban mom voters who Kamala Harris has reached out to and that Trump in many ways has alienated, whether they can carry her across the finish line.
But, new migrants to Florida, they also, they kind of like the no tax thing.
Yes, there's income tax.
There's certain things that just aren't going to change because that's the way people are, and I think that's happened in Texas too. Because this is the day every 4 years we have a discussion about Texas. Actually, this year for the first time we've had, I think, almost no real debate about Texas. But in the past several cycles, we've heard, oh, Texas is going blue. Texas is going blue because of the demographics. And what we've found, though, in Texas is that people who come to Texas, whether it's from south of the border or from, California, kind of like Texas. And that's why they came there. And they were getting away from something else and they were coming to something else. And so Texas doesn't seem to go blue in part because people come to Texas for Texas. And I think Florida is having a similar thing. So it'd be interesting to see if that backfires at all. I don't know how big the numbers are going to get, but if it backfires trying to bluify the suburbs or these other places and ending up strengthening, Republican vote.
I think that is true with the proviso, and it's a huge proviso of the Dobbs decision, which interfered with this progression or evolution, political or ideological evolution that you're talking about. Because while I think people do want to move to a place where there are fewer taxes and fewer regulations, I think we can now pretty much assert that the Dobbs decision and the ending of the constitutional right that was adduced in 1972 to an abortion, 1973, had an earthquake effect on people, because it was like, I like lower taxes, and but this and if you can do this, what else can you do? And it has haunted people, and it is unnerving people who aren't that political. Abortion as a political issue was a rallying cry on the right for 40 years, very successfully, that flipped entirely. Have you heard a pro-life politician walking around saying, I'm proudly pro-life, I love Dobbs, I don't know, maybe in Mississippi somebody is saying stuff like that, but in where I am and where there are contested House races, all the Democrats talk about is Dobbs, and all the conservatives talk about is crazy liberal so-and-so wants to join Kamala's crazy liberal agenda. They never say they're pro-life. They never say they're proud of casting pro-life votes or whatever. There is no longer a kind of pushback. Now, maybe there doesn't have to be, because what happened, and there's nothing for them to say, but it was a positive. It has become a liability, and it's a liability all over the country. It's a liability in Iowa, it would appear, if you take any factual, if you think that the Seltzer poll that showed Kamala, or, the election moving Kamala's way is true, even if her idea that Kamala's going to win the state, or the polls evidence that she's going to win the state, seems far-fetched. Iowa, Kansas, these states that sort of limited by referendum the extent of the state laws controlling abortion. There is a lot of that evidence, and it has complicated the big sort. The big sort is people generally moving to places where they are ideologically incongruent with the people who are like them, and a lot of people who wanted what you can get in Texas and Florida don't want social conservative, at least if Dobbs is a representative of serious social conservatism. Now,
yeah, I mean, it's confusing
yeah.
because in Florida, there's a ballot measure that will essentially rewrite the state constitution to guarantee abortion rights, and it could very well pass. I think it's expected to pass, but it's also expected that Trump will win Florida. So the confusion is multiple levels, right?
But that would prove my point, which is to say that you could have a whole bunch of people who are happy to vote for Trump,
right,
who can look at a proposition and say, I'm voting for the Republican presidential candidate, and I'm going to enshrine a right to abortion in our state constitution. That's the kind of ticket splitting that happens when a controversial issue doesn't necessarily cut.
Well, and I think
that's not the partisan. What did Kornacki call it? Partisan gravity. This is an issue that may be outside of partisan gravity.
Sure. I wasn't here when Kornacki was, so I don't really know what partisan gravity means.
He means that for example,
is nonpartisan.
But if Trump wins in a given state, the partisan gravity effect on, say, Dave McCormick in Pennsylvania will pull McCormick over the finish line. Whereas 40 years ago, it was perfectly plausible for Reagan to win a state and for a Democratic senator to win the same in the same election. Less partisan gravity.
I think what I'm saying is we're beginning to see the future of pro-life politics take shape, and we need to recognize that Trump has already moved the Republican Party away from the pro-life movement by saying that it's a state issue, by declining to offer any views on federal policy toward abortion. Of course, there's federal statutes already on the books about abortion, and then there are a host of policies that the administrative state deals with, such as the Mexico City policy, such as funding for Planned Parenthood, that Trump has shied away from talking about. J.D. Vance not shying away as much, but Trump, of course, at the top of the ticket has. I think that if Kamala Harris wins the election and we look at the exit polls and voter surveys and find that abortion played a role many of us didn't expect, say, even 2 weeks ago in the result, the Republican Party will continue to move away from pro-life causes at the national level. And I was kind of going over this history just yesterday, so I'll repeat it in capsule form, but people don't recognize that, the Republican Party was not necessarily going to be the pro-life party, even at Roe v. Wade, in the first decade or so of Roe v. Wade. I mean, Nixon had no real thoughts on abortion. Reagan, as governor of California, signed in an abortion expansion into law. And Gerald Ford, and with consulting with Betty, the first lady, they were pro-choice. So it wasn't until the evangelical Christian movement soured on Jimmy Carter in Jimmy Carter's term and turned toward Reagan, who was ready to accept their support and join forces with them in 1980, that you began to see the solidification of the GOP as the pro-life party. And even then, John, it was contested for years.
I mean, absolutely. And you know what? This is an important piece of history, because Jimmy Carter, until George W. Bush, Jimmy Carter was the only evangelical president, was a president who actually emerged in his base as a Southern evangelical, building his support in the grassroots through the evangelical churches of the South. Since he was his sister was a famous evangelical preacher, Ruth Carter Stapleton, and he used language that was very much directed right at evangelical sensibilities. Right, when he told Playboy that he had harbored lust in his heart, though he had never stepped out on his wife, and that sort of thing. And then he became president, and in a weird analogy to what Christine is talking about, inside the White House during the Carter presidency started to tip very much to the social left. There was a panel, or I don't know what call it, a panel, a commission, or something.
It was the conference
on the family. That was the first time that ideas about how the family needed to be redefined in the modern era to deal with more unconventional forms and ways of life and lifestyles. That was the far, while people in New York and places like that paid no attention, that was the 5 alarm fire that moved the evangelical movement almost wholesale to the right and to start looking hard at Ronald Reagan, who, as you say, had signed an abortion rights law, had signed an abortion bill into law, but was known to be a law and order guy who believed in the classic Republican small town values. And when Reagan ran in 1980, he ran on these 5 core messages that were directed right at that audience, right? Family, neighborhood. I can't remember the 5 of them, but family and neighborhood were 2 of the 5 things that he was saying he would preserve or strengthen in his presidency. So
faith, work, and peace were the other 3.
Faith, work, and peace. Okay, so faith obviously vital there. So we do have this possibility that the extreme social liberalism of the Biden administration, followed hard on by what might be the extreme social liberalism of a Harris administration, could produce this weird knock-on effect that ends up taking them down. It's not organized in the same way because there isn't an organized, although the evangelicals weren't organized either. Like, they organized very fast and became a kind of unified force almost overnight in American politics. Actually, they weren't that unified, but I mean, let's say 60%.
Ralph Reed brought together a movement that was
right.
grounded.
But Reed was later, right? Reed was the
90s.
political director for Jerry Falwell,
Right.
but it was 1980. It was the formation of the moral majority,
right,
that turned this, and then it was sort of like, oh my God, there are 40 million people who believe this in the United States, and if they all vote, oh boy,
There's also another angle to this, which is, as Trump has been saying, don't hate me for Roe because all these red states are voting to put abortion protections in the Constitution, right? That's the sort of thing that will only further Republicans feeling like they can step away from it, because if you are in Oklahoma, you may not have to be pro-abortion, or it may benefit you as a Republican, in some of these red states for the first time in a while it may not be a litmus test for Republicans, even in red states. There may be a new consensus that emerges that this is, we left it up to the people, and the people said they want abortion here. And Republicans who want to keep their jobs in Congress may just say, this is just right, this level, even some of them in red states.
But this is where I think there was a real missed opportunity for Trump. He was not able to articulate exactly what you just said, Seth, on the campaign trail. Nikki Haley did in the primary debates. There was a real opportunity for him to make that it's basically an argument about federalism.
Well,
and
he
to say,
could.
We're not extreme.
No, that's when he said, everybody hated Roe. Right. Everybody wanted me to overturn Roe because somebody told him,
doing a lot of work.
Somebody told him that Ruth Bader Ginsburg thought that Roe had been a political mistake for the left, and she did. And there
she said it was bad law, not that it was a political mistake.
Right,
and bad constitutional law.
Well, bad constitutional law, but right, no, but she said it would have been better had it been left to the political system, and that she was right in the sense that the political system, if you follow gay marriage as an example, the political system probably would have eventually, as it was, which is one of the reasons that this came before the Supreme Court in 1973 anyway, the political system would have probably gone to a point at which it enshrined abortion, at least in enough states to make a gigantic difference.
It could again. It could happen
again. Exactly. Right. But he was told that. So he then, in his maximalist car salesman mind, said, it's for everybody. Everybody wanted this. I was just fulfilling the wishes of everyone.
There's another reason that I think Republicans will find themselves potentially moving away from the issue comfortably, which is that there are newer radical social / culture war issues that also seem like hills to die on, namely the trans issue and trans stuff with kids. This was not a concern for Jimmy Carter, for Ronald Reagan, for Richard Nixon. They can move to that. And there they have a lot more support.
It wasn't really a concern for Barack Obama.
No, that's
I mean, this is something that just popped up. You know, it was funny. We talk about the ironies of history, and it's just a quick diversion. In the debate over same-sex marriage, conservatives took the view that the slippery slope would lead to polygamy. And then when the court ruled for gay marriage in 2013, actually, we haven't had a move toward polygamy. The Supreme Court same-sex marriage decision produced the trans movement, which was kind of random. No one was counting on that. So you can't really predict the outcomes. But Abe is absolutely right. The anti-trans view, the anti-gender fluidity view, the view that we should not be transing children, and the view that biological men should not play in women's sports, that has much broader support than support for restrictions on abortion. So the new social conservatism is less, it kind of inhabits two states at once, because the GOP is still very much the religious party, but social conservatism has less religious tones and auras right now, because it's about two sexes. It's about safe streets. It's about a certain view of patriotism, right? Anti-1619 ideology. That actually, I think, has much broader potential than the Christian influenced social conservative thought that dominated from 1980 to 2016.
But, you know, that's one of my concerns about the Oprah, Rogan, Musk rhetoric. So let's just put Oprah to one side, because that's just Trump's going to be a dictator and is going to suspend the Constitution or whatever. So there's Elon Musk and there's Joe Rogan. So Joe Rogan's main thing is he's a libertarian. He likes to smoke pot on the air. They got weed largely decriminalized or legalized in much, if not most, of America, whatever. But he doesn't like the government mucking in your affairs, right? That's sort of his thing. And then you have Elon Musk, who is clearly a social liberal, except that he has a daughter or a kid who is transitioning. And this has horrified him in a very interesting way, in my view. Complicated, very hard to understand person. But he is responding in a gut, visceral, autonomic fashion to the idea that this child who is his child is now turning into something else based on social fashion, possible mental illness, and the willingness of a compliant society to facilitate this change. And that, more than anything else, if you sort of follow his journey over the last year and a half, is what explains his idea that this is the last election we'll ever have. Because the gut idea there, and it's a complicated thing that even Jamel Bouie kind of agrees with, is what we are voting for this year is a redefinition of what it means to be human. And Republicans don't want to do that and are therefore retrogressive and monstrous, because this change is inevitable and it's good. It's liberationist. It is radically a radical redefinition of, and what's so great about humanity anyway? Look, we do all these terrible things, and what's so great about America anyway? We did this. We were founded in slavery, and all of that. And Musk represents, in a strange way, this like, no, this is not the world. You are moving us into a world I don't want to live in.
But it's not. I mean, I think I agree with you. I'm sure there's a deeply personal component to his journey, as you describe it. But there's also, with Rogan, he shares a real allergy to the sort of authoritarian insistence on this utopian scheme. And in that, I mean, and that then plays out over how he's been treated by the federal government, his other businesses, SpaceX, the threats sort of veiled and not so veiled about, shutting down what he's trying to do as an entrepreneur. And that's where the gender stuff, I think that's absolutely correct what Abe said. If you're telling people that a man and a woman can't biologically exist, if you're telling people that watching a male boxer in the Olympics pummel a female boxer in the female boxing tournament and say, you cannot say this person is a man when they are biologically male, they have XY chromosomes. That is telling people not to believe what is right in front of them. That is a very common authoritarian technique. And then when you look at the complicity of the media in calling anyone who contradicts that narrative a transphobe or whatnot, I think that oppressiveness is something that he's very good at articulating.
Can I offer another explanation based on what I think is the most exemplary debate of the campaign season? It was neither of the presidential debates. It was a congressional debate that occurred just this week between Maggie Goodlander and Lily Tang Williams. Now, Maggie Goodlander is the wife of National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. She grew up, you might say, in privilege. She went to very exclusive schools. She has had a very rarefied career. She has, of course, a great connection to power in her spouse. Lily Tang Williams is a legal immigrant whose family fled China, who had to endure the Cultural Revolution. She kind of rose, and as she said in her closing statement in this debate, she's a believer in the American dream because that's what brought her family here and how she's been able to prosper. And boy, she laid into Maggie Goodlander in this debate, talking about how it's just incredible that her husband has presided over the worst deterioration in the world scene in decades and has suffered no consequences. And Goodlander is pretending to understand people's problems when she is protected from them and has been in her entire life. And to hear Lily Tang Williams, and I urge everyone to look at the video clip because as an immigrant, her English is very accented, but it has such passion and such belief in this country and what has made it special in her eyes as an immigrant from communist China, contrasted with the condescending elitism that has no accountability ever represented by Goodlander. I think that is actually kind of what's being decided in this election. And look, because of the peculiarities of the candidates in the presidential level, the elitism could win. There could still be no accountability for it for another 4 years. But at root, I think that tension expressed in this debate is also what's animating people like Rogan and Elon Musk. Musk in particular has a certain view of America as this dynamo, this technological innovator, this huge economy that's always churning. And he believes that special quality of the United States will be better protected under Trump than with Harris's top-heavy bureaucratic regulatory approach.
I'm glad you brought up the Lily Tang Williams debate because Maggie Goodlander is a fascinating character. Like
the look on her face.
She is not fascinating at all. She's actually quite dull. But as an object lesson, she is a fascinating character that, Tom Wolfe, we would need a sort of present day Tom Wolfe or an old fashioned David Brooks pre-weave David Brooks to portray, because she's very wealthy. She was from a Republican family. As a young person, she worked for John McCain and the McCain Institute. She shifted her gravity. She married a Democratic operative. She is now fully there and ran a campaign in New Hampshire that she is going to win. I think it seems unquestionable that she's going to win the seat, talking about the problems of the middle class. And it's that moment in the debate where Lily Tang Williams goes absolutely
because she
postal.
rented an apartment so that she's a carpetbagger. She lives in a massive multi-million-dollar house, and she rented an apartment in that district just so she could run on the problems of the middle class that she in another district has never seen.
And can I just say, if the parties were reversed,
she doesn't live in the house in Portsmouth anyway, because she lives in Washington with her husband. Now that's, again, carpetbagging. Complaining about carpetbagging is a tried and true tradition that just doesn't really work very well.
No, it's not the carpetbagging, it's the condescension.
Don't you tell me about the problems of the middle class. You're not middle class. You've never been middle class. You're a phony. You don't live here. You don't have the middle class experiences, and you don't understand the problems of people like me.
And can I just say, if the parties were reversed, she would be the new AOC. Like, she would be a superstar. She would be on Hope posters, every nightly political show on MSNBC, CNN, and all the rest would be doing this. She would have just, we would have just seen a star born in front of us.
Well, we may yet.
Democrat had spoken to a Republican.
I saw a star. I love her. She's great.
I love her. And anyway, But you're right that there was some kind of cultural crystallization, which is, you guys you represent the true American elite. You want to tell people that the problem with America is rich people and how they control things and they move things and wrest things in their direction. And the line of someone like Lily Tang Williams is, that's not who the elite really are anymore. The elite is this network or amalgam or system, as I think, Matt, you called them yesterday, of people who go to the same schools, who are interested in the same cultural trends, and who advance them across institutions that have been bent and reshaped to their will. And they all have these supports that support each other. So academia supports the intentions of state, local, and federal governmental moves in a liberal direction by providing crapola social science stats and things to ballast their arguments. Corporations have been turned to promote liberal values with their for-profit things, like, the commercials that they produce and all of that kind of preach a social line that is acceptable to this elite, and that's who really runs America now, and that's who is pushing trans, is pushing this radical redefinition of what it means to be human, is weakening the family, and this is the other main big thing that it's hard to talk about, is making it very difficult to be a male in the United States as you grow up and become a fully functioning citizen. The kinds of things that are of interest to you, the kinds of things that males are good at or bad, are less valued, are more questioned, are criminalized, are medicated against. And so, that isn't going to go without a response, right? That's the post-COVID thing also, is you have COVID, which then gave you a taste of what liberal authoritarianism would be like. And then you have all of this stuff, and you got 50% of the population that has been under assault for a generation. How this comes out in the wash, nobody can even begin to know.
Well, that's part of the when we talk about the working class split too, right? Which is that fewer men than women are getting college degrees, right, and things like that. So there's an economic aspect to this also, and there's the sort of lost boys question to this also, which is that how it shakes out in class-related ways too that we see in the election, and we don't always realize all the factors that have pushed it that way. But it's one of the things that, we may see when we see voting splits of the kind, the gender gap that we're seeing this year, which is highly unusual. Although we're used to a gender gap, it's beyond what we usually see.
But let's talk about class too, because that gets to another interesting aspect of this with relation to COVID that, again, has not been adjudicated or litigated really socially, although a lot of people got punished. A lot of liberal politicians got punished from COVID in ways that we haven't quite factored in yet, certainly at the local level. And even stuff like the defenestration of Andrew Cuomo, which was done by leftists, not by people upset about the nursing homes.
If
but
Cuomo comes back, will it be a fenestration?
There you go. An infenestration.
No, I've never thought about that until this morning. But refenestration.
Right? Refenestration, right. And he may well. But where I was going with this is that we had a class division in the United States, the likes of which I don't think we've really reckoned with, which is that everybody with means went inside to protect themselves and stay safe and healthy based on what they understood. And that was only possible because of tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people who were not allowed to stay inside, who delivered your groceries and worked in the Amazon warehouses and drove the trucks and drove the Ubers and did the work of the hands. And they got nothing. I mean, we all celebrated the first responders, but the American economy and American society were kept going by people who logically or theoretically were putting their lives at risk to support the lives of, it's like the Decameron. It's like Boccaccio's Decameron. But the wealthy are staying in their villas and having debauching in their villas while the poor dying in the streets.
But a lot of those people also lost their jobs because of the kind of heavy-handed, over-regulatory state in their local communities and also at the federal level. And many of them have not recovered economically from that fall, even with all of the money that was legislated for them. There is still a real gap. And that's actually where inflation this is why inflation still matters, because 4 years ago, they were struggling enough and it has not improved for them. Now, if you're rich, if you're the Goodlanders of the world, you've actually earned more money. Like, things are great for you. You already own a big home. You're not trying to buy your first home. All of these factors mean that class division that Seth is talking about is getting bigger and bigger. And it is more male because of the educational divide too.
I'll just add that it struck me that we haven't really talked about the pandemic all that much in this campaign. Neither candidate has brought it up. I mean, you've always made the point, John, that it's a sub rosa issue, and discontent over the school closures and the lockdowns lingers out there. And of course, the vaccine skepticism that's taken hold since the pandemic is out there as well. But I just want to use this opportunity to mention a couple of other issues that have not been addressed during this campaign. The most significant one, of course, is the national debt. Neither candidate has said anything about it. There are no plans. The best that you can say for Harris's plan is that, according to independent outfits, it will increase the debt less than Trump's plans in a static environment. All these projections are based on static environments.
By static environment, you mean that they don't take account of what kinds of economic growth might be produced.
Exactly, right. The unknown,
by the plans. You're just talking about what's taken out.
Technological innovation. Yeah. But neither candidate has a way to address this huge problem. I mean, of course, this is the first year where debt service is now higher than the national defense budget, right? And usually that's a bad sign for empires, as Neil Ferguson has chronicled. Another issue that has gotten very little attention is China, which I think is interesting. Now, granted, there are two hot wars right now. There's Ukraine, there's Israel in the Middle East, but China is still this rising power, and it's still very belligerent. And yet there's a weird kind of consensus almost in terms of kind of our economic warfare with China that I think is leading the two candidates not to address it. But the next president could have to make major decisions. And I believe that if Harris is the next president, she'll be tested by China within months, maybe even during the transition.
Every president in the last, since Bush in 2000, has faced a test from China in the first 6 months of his administration. Bush had the downing of the plane in early 2001. I can't remember what Obama's was, but that was big, and now I'm just blocking on what it was. And then Trump, of course, Biden had the balloons. Yeah. Trump had a trade issue, or North Korea China trade issue. So China does this, like you can bet on it that
and it's not acting like it's interested in a peaceful resolution to, say, the Taiwan problem, right? I mean, for China, Taiwan's a problem, not for Taiwan or for us. But you had a massive drill just conducted recently that basically simulated an embargo around Taiwan, and you have massive buildup of the Chinese military complex. So it's been a little striking to me that there has not been a serious discussion. Now, of course, this has been a very unserious campaign in a lot of ways, but these three issues are still out there: the pandemic, the debt, and China, and no one is touching them.
But it's a fascinating question that Matt brings up, because I would argue that since 2020, Americans haven't had the luxury of voting or thinking in terms of politics in terms of abstract ideas. And by abstract, I don't mean they're not real. I mean, they're now responding to politics from an experiential level. What am I paying for? What's my family going through? How am I being restricted or not restricted in my interactions and in my pursuits? Things like the debt, it's real. I'm not saying it's not. The threat of China is very real. There's a sort of next level quality to those things. You have to be in a certain place to really get worked up about those ideas, and more Americans are not in that place.
Trump and Biden both came into office with the idea, or their general foreign policy posture with the idea, that they needed to pivot the attention of the American foreign posture in the world toward China, to move away. Trump obviously literally wanted to move away from being an Atlanticist to focus on the threat in the Far East. Biden said China is our main competitor. And then, you know what? The real world intrudes. Crises happen. Biden pulls out of Afghanistan and melts the world down such that Putin invades Ukraine, and suddenly China's role and its behavior, absent a Russian crisis, China could have been dealt with. But there will always be betting on the come on an issue. It's like, we're going to prepare. We need to make sure that China doesn't rise and take Taiwan by doing things preemptively and repositioning assets and doing a certain type of buildup in a certain kind of place. And when you actually have to deal with primary problems, it's very hard to deal with secondary problems, which is why you don't want to behave fecklessly like Biden and create primary problems with your stupid and awful decisions.
Right. And the
particularly
other thing
if you're trying to focus on changing the American force posture in the world, you need to keep other places quiet. And you're not like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to throw all the cards up in the air and see what happens in this place where we have had a national military interest for 20 years. I'm just going to pull out. What the hell? Maybe everything will be fine. And then 3 years later, we've got the question of whether or not we are North Koreans are fighting in Kharkiv. Like,
well, that's the thing I want to say, which is that the other part of the real world intruding is that you can pretend in these sort of like partisan mind games, who is the good guy in a vacuum in each of these different conflicts. But reality says Russia and China and North Korea and Iran are all on the same side, and they're all fighting the same battle. And Israel and Ukraine and the United States and, Western Europe are all on the same side. And it doesn't really matter that we have these partisan or political fights. And obviously domestic politics plays into what you can do, what room and leverage you have as a president. But in the grand scheme of things, there are the good guys and the bad guys. And I hate to oversimplify it, but Russia is never going to end up on the side that helps you in the US, regardless of how you feel about corruption in Ukraine. There are these bigger things that affect the world in bigger ways than a lot of the fights that we have. And so we get stuck into these situations where you have, Republicans are suspicious of Ukraine, and even on culture war stuff, and the Democrats are suspicious of Israel. But the world reacts according to reality. And the reality is that those two countries are our allies, right? And they're fighting a battle that we are also fighting, and we want them to win, and we want to win. And Russia and China can't be separated from each other. They can't be separated from Iran or from North Korea. There's some general clear battle lines here that every president is going to have to confront regardless of their priors.
But this is, again, where the failure of leadership, the leadership vacuum, and this is where the rhetoric vacuum is huge. During the Cold War, there were constant concerns, both in popular culture and in our political culture, about what the Soviet Union was trying to do to infiltrate the United States. Just this week, there was another Chinese espionage attempt revealed, constant hacks, the spy balloon being the most obvious, the one that I think probably impacted Americans most broadly, because there it was floating across our nuclear silos, taking pictures while the Biden administration twiddled its thumbs. But Seth's point, I think part of that, again, we have this inability to call good and evil what it is, and to say this nation state wants to destroy us. And so we need to be on guard, both at home and abroad, about our own interests, protecting them. And that's a moral weakness on the part of the United States, that we can't even speak in those terms anymore. And Trump has not actually done much to change that. I'm not saying we need to return to Cold War rhetoric, but there was some clarity there that was useful in determining policy matters.
No, Trump takes what you might call a pre-modern view, which has been misunderstood by Democrats who have been desperately trying to paint him as a Russian stooge for a decade, right? And to believe that he is some kind of an agent of influence of Vladimir Putin. And this is a misunderstanding of him. I don't like the way he talks about Putin. With Christine, with you, I think this is a terrible way to go about dealing with somebody who is an adversary like him, because he doesn't respond properly. But what he basically is saying is Putin and Xi, they are worthy adversaries. I respect them. They're tough. They know what they're doing. They get things done. They know how to handle it. And I'm the guy, I see them clearly. I do not judge them. I will contest with them. They know that I feel this way about them, and therefore Putin would never have gone into Ukraine if I had been president, because he knows that no matter how much I respect him, I'm going to beat the hell out of him if he does anything wrong. Now, you can believe or not believe, you can think that he's a paper tiger and that that's nonsense, but that's what Trump's rhetoric, this kind of anti-ideological rhetoric about foreign policy, is about. No one's scared of us. We need to make people scared of us, because when they're not scared of us, they'll do whatever the hell they want. And I'm going to scare them. And nobody is scared of that old man. And certainly no one is ever going to be scared of Kamala Harris. But he doesn't really, in the same way that he couldn't talk about Roe v. Wade, and he couldn't, or Dobbs, or he can't talk about things like the debt and all of that. He can't articulate this, because he is in terms of policy, he is maybe the most inarticulate leader the West has ever seen. Because I can structure his argument in 3 seconds, and his brain cannot create a linear narrative to explain what I just explained. He's had 10 years to do it.
He constructs policy like he
dances.
It's kind of...
Yeah, exactly.
Can I talk about the failures of Biden's rhetoric as well? Because Biden has adopted the democracy versus authoritarianism framework to explain his foreign policy. And that on one level is very similar to the free world versus the communist empire during the Cold War. However, Biden then takes the democracy versus authoritarianism and reflects it back on home, which did not happen during the Cold War. So when you look at Biden's speeches, he's saying that America is fighting authoritarianism abroad and at home, and the Trump people. They're authoritarians just like Putin and Xi, and that does not make for a very successful foreign policy either, because all of a sudden you're including half the country in the opposition camp, and that's not the way to bring them on board a policy where you are trying to secure liberty for Americans by leading on the world stage.
And we look weak and divided as a result as well to our enemies.
Yeah.
It's a big part of the turn on the right against Ukraine, because the Biden administration has sort of established that Zelensky and the Ukrainians are on the opposite side of the American conservatives or the American right.
Well, and Zelensky didn't help by going to that ammo factory in Pennsylvania with the governor and senator of Pennsylvania, who are both Democrats. This is one of the complexities of this of the Ukraine war that you're absolutely right to observe.
Right. I don't look. The thing is, not to be too vulgar about it, but we've seen an outbreak of authoritarianism in the United States in the last 10 years, and it wasn't by the Trump administration. It was by the governor of New York. It was by the governor of New Jersey and the governor of Connecticut, people who were talking about, Andrew Cuomo was talking about arresting people at the border of New York State if they came in from a state that did not have a vaccine mandate.
And the Biden administration collaborating with big tech to suppress speech of average Americans.
Exactly. So we have seen an authoritarian problem in the United States, and it came in the middle of an emergency, which is when you would typically see governments restricting freedoms because emergencies allow that to happen, right? You can set curfews, you can close bridges, you can do all sorts of things, particularly in a pandemic, if you're talking about trying to stop the spread of an incredibly virulent pathogen or contagion. But they really enjoyed it. That was the thing that unnerved everybody, was that it wasn't being done more in sorrow than in anger. It was Andrew Cuomo sitting around saying, "Yeah, I'll let 25% seating in your restaurant. But you know what? You can't serve beer. You have to eat food. You can't just have beer." And he's like moving chess pieces around the way Amity Shlaes describes FDR in her book, The Forgotten Man, sort of making these choices about what businesses get to do this, that, or the other thing as the National Recovery Administration is charging full steam ahead until the Supreme Court says, whoa, the government isn't really allowed to do what he's doing. That kosher butcher needs to be allowed to stay open. He's got, he's serving a religious audience. He's serving people who can't eat unless he does his business, and you're shutting him down on the basis of what?
But
so
they also didn't follow the restrictions that they imposed on others, which was revealed. Right. Because that was revealed, I think that added, unlike during FDR's years in office, we saw the governor of California at the French Laundry while everyone else wasn't allowed to get takeout in their neighborhood, and their local businesses shuttered.
So this is not whataboutism. I'm not. What I'm saying is that the democracy is on the ballot thing was a the better case for democracy being on the ballot was in 2022, when in fact Republican candidates all across the country in local races were running against people who were making decisions about school curricula and when schools were open and closed and what people could wear and who could get arrested and what people were this, that they had no right and business to be handling. Or again, the CDC making rules and provisions based on home occupancy and rules about rentals and what a landlord could do with somebody who wasn't paying their rent. The Centers for Disease Control, things went haywire, and it wasn't Trump. That's what's so ironic about what you said, Bechlaw, saying history will no longer be written in the United States, which would come as a great surprise to the late Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who wrote the greatest work of history of the 20th century, while he was in Russia, forbidden to write history.
To say nothing,
to publish history.
To say nothing of the recent situation that we recounted on the podcast, whereby the Biden White House wanted the rewriting of an official transcript to reflect a different meaning.
Yes, I was going to say the left's already rewritten history. Of course, it doesn't matter if it exists.
So not only isn't this whataboutism, the fact is that Trump didn't do anything like that, and they've been doing it. He didn't do it. Maybe people in his ambit and his camp talk about how, because liberals and leftists are so authoritarian, we need to adopt and take over their tactics.
He does flirt with saying, when I regain
I know, I'll be a dictator for a
do
day.
Things. So that's worrisome.
No, he does say it, and I am in no way, shape, or form really defending him. I am not, and his rhetoric is irresponsible. And maybe this is a moment to say that J.D. Vance closed out the election last night in a repellent manner by saying, we're going to Washington to take out the trash, and that trash's name is Kamala Harris. Like, you know what? Go to hell. You spent all this time talking about how we should be friends with the other side, and you did so nicely in the debate and say, God bless your heart. Tim Walz, your poor son. And he's calling the Vice President of the United States and his rival candidate trash, saying we're taking out the trash. The trash's name is Kamala Harris. That's just disgusting. I'm sorry. That really brought this horrible 2-year election period to a very uncomfortable close for me. Am I being too prissy? It was late at night. Maybe he was tired. I don't know.
Biden called Trump supporters trash.
Right. So, I mean, I think he was
called
a whole lot of trash going around.
Right.
There's a whole lot of trash.
Fair enough. But we criticized him for that. So I'm just
right.
Sure.
Right.
It's just no, I just mean Vance was singing from a good hymnal for a while to soften his image. But I guess, the question is, who's the real J.D. Vance, if there is one? And is it the one who's bless your son's heart, Tim Walz? That's horrible. Christ forgive Christ on a crutch, or whatever it was he said in the debate. And then he goes around saying what he just said. I don't know. It's very
the voting ends within 24 hours. So then what I'm saying is that rhetoric will end. The voting period.
Oh yeah, it'll end, and you know what? And then everything will be fine. It'll all be everything, because they're all going to be the president for all the people.
Wine and roses,
except for the garbage.
Wine and roses after the polls close this evening.
Okay, so
I love the word you got a kumbaya note. This is great.
We haven't even talked about the day, and I just wanted to mention 2 things about what's going on. One is that immense amounts of talk about the early vote and Democrats and the early vote, and something funny happened yesterday. So I don't think that there is first of all, the early vote is down about 20 million from 2020. Okay, that was COVID. People wouldn't go out, blah, blah, so they made it so easy to vote. But basically, making it easy to vote has now been enshrined almost everywhere. So the net result as we go into Election Day is that the percentage of Republicans who voted early in the early vote was completely consistent with 2020. 34% of the early vote was Republican in the places where you can count, by party. The Democratic percentage of the vote that was Democratic has dropped measurably, from like 62% to 46%, while the Republican number stayed constant at 34%. So that means that a whole bunch of people, and 20 million fewer people, voted early and by mail this year than in 2020. So either a whole bunch of people became independents, or we don't know who they are. Whatever it is, though we hear Democratic enthusiasm is really high and all of that, something happened. And if Democrats don't show up at the polls today the way they haven't in previous, Republicans win the day of vote classically. So Democrats do seem to have won the early vote in aggregate across the United States. But if they don't show up on election day, all this talk about how the election is close, it's not going to be close. Let's assume they're going to show up on election day, because why not? Who's going to stop them? What do they have to do? They might as well, and all of that. But in Pennsylvania, there is a 500,000 or 600,000 vote gap between what Democrats had banked in the early vote in 2020 versus 2024. Now, can they get that vote? Yeah, the 500,000 people can turn out in Philadelphia and erase that deficit. But they didn't want to have that deficit. And then I noticed that the Democrat who is the biggest cheerleader for Democrats win everything and everybody loves us and everybody hates Republicans, Simon Rosenberg, former, big cheese at the DNC, who got 2020 right and got 2022 right, and said there is going to be no red wave in 2022, last night said it's not happening for Republicans and we're going to win everything. And so I was like, oh my God, really? That's interesting. Like, he's, you got to listen to him. And then he pulled out what is called the modeled party vote, which is, according to some model, and you don't know what the terms are on the model, Republicans are underperforming and Democrats are overperforming. Now, why is that interesting? Because we have hard data. We have 83 million votes cast. So you don't need a model. Like, that's like saying, I don't like what happened in the election, so I'm going to go by the polls. Like, we know who turned out.
According to my model, Aaron Judge caught that ball in the fifth inning.
Yeah, exactly.
And this is a different
My
game.
model says there's no way Aaron Judge is just simply going to drop a ball. He's a really good fielder. Just the inning before, he slammed into the wall catching a ball. He's great. So I'm just going to ignore that. So I look at that and I'm like, I don't know if he's got hopium or if he's being dishonest or whatever.
There's a lot of hopium going around on both sides.
Right.
And I think our friend Mark Halprin did a community service this morning by pointing out what to do before the polls close and what not to do. And one of the things he said was, ignore most everything until we're about an hour and a half in to the actual vote count. And that's when people can see, okay, how are things going? And I subscribe to him. And so you can find, Larry Sabato's crystal ball has Harris winning the election by keeping the blue wall intact. They say in the write-up, it's really close. He could win one of the blue wall states. But if Trump wins one of the blue wall states while holding the Sunbelt states, then he's going to win. Nate Silver has his final model, I think, shows Kamala Harris with a 50.1% chance.
No. Oh, no.
Well, that's how he played it, right? He played it by... Yeah.
No, if you read, his prediction is, his model says that over 80,000, you run 80,000 simulations. These are called casinos. You run 80,000 simulations, and she wins them 0.001% 0.03. She wins
Right.
in the aggregate 0.03%, not
50.3,
not
right?
a third of a percent, 0.03% of a percent.
And of course, the simulations were also what the Hillary campaign were doing in the final days, and that's what Robbie Mook, maybe the worst campaign manager in the history of the United States, said to Hillary Clinton: "You don't have to go to Wisconsin because the simulations have it in the bag." So let's just wait. Let's just wait.
Someone put it very well on Twitter this morning, and I'm sorry that I don't remember who it was, but they said it's like election day is like being in the eye of the hurricane. There's chaos behind us. There's chaos in front of us. We all know the storm is here, but we are somehow in this weirdly calm, suspended state.
Okay, I'm going to give people my one guideline, which I've checked with people who are more expert than I at this, who say it's not a bad way to look at it. So the first major state to close is Florida. Everybody expects that Trump will win Florida, although there is this complicating matter of the abortion matter on the ballot, which doesn't mean Kamala is going to win, but Trump will win Florida. The averages have him winning Florida by at least 7. And, there also we may have an understatement problem. Here's what I am going to look for. Over or under performance, which is to say, if the early counties that come in, and the Florida vote is like a machine now, so the vote just comes in really fast. If she overperforms in Florida, even by losing, she comes in and is losing by 3. And that number remains consistent as the count rolls and rolls and rolls and rolls and rolls in. I'm going to say she's going to win. That is to say, I think that will suggest that she has pulled people out to the polls, even in a state that she might not win, and that therefore there's Democratic strength of the sort that they hope.
Florida's weird, though. That's my caveat. As a Floridian, I just got to say Florida's weird.
Okay. I mean, there are a couple of other early states. There are states like Indiana, Kentucky. There will be other examples of this. In Kentucky, obviously, an interesting political state because it's a Trump state, but it has a Democratic governor.
Yeah, so Florida went for Trump by basically 3 points last time.
Right.
So
right now,
and
Biden
won the election, right? So if you see that that's the margin, then you could say, okay, things are looking good for Harris,
for Kamala, right? Okay, so that's about it. Because if you
Indiana, put on Indiana, Trump won by 16 points in 2020. Yeah. So if he's not pulling 16-point margin, well, then maybe that's another good sign for her.
And Steve Kornacki told us last week to look at Hamilton County, Indiana, because it's a suburb. It's a well-to-do suburb of Indianapolis and is ideologically a little more flavored than a lot of the rest of the state. And if there will be Democratic overperformance that suggests a larger Democratic passion to get out to the polls and vote for Harris, that will show up in results in Hamilton County that are far closer than you might otherwise expect. And that's an early state. And as I say, Kentucky is also interesting because it has Democratic politicians who win in Kentucky, unlike a lot of other states like that. But that's all anybody's gotten. If you follow Nate Silver, if you follow John, if you follow these people, Larry Sabato is predicting a 276 or 272. Someone's predicted 270. All of the people who are doing that predicting, including are people who want Harris to win. And in the end, if it's close, John Ralston, the dean of Nevada reporters, said he has no idea he has Harris winning by 0.3% because he thinks the ghost of Harry Reid will push Harris across the finish line.
Yeah.
But that's just saying I want her to win.
It's kind of
nobody knows. Nobody
just wait.
knows. And that means that Trump could win Pennsylvania and Harris could win Georgia. It means Trump could win Michigan and Harris could win Arizona. It means Trump could win Wisconsin and
If she's
Harris
winning Iowa,
could win North Carolina.
If she's winning Iowa, Trump is probably going to lose the election.
That's what I think. That's without right. So
that's what to look for around 10 o'clock.
It also
11
depends
o'clock at night. Who's winning Iowa, and
right. And
what
by
what,
by the way,
what cookie model you're looking at, because the Oakmont, Pennsylvania bakery has been selling more Trump cookies than Kamala cookies, but the Evanston, Illinois bakery has been selling way more Kamala cookies than Trump cookies. So even when it comes to bakeries and cookie polls, there's an even split. You don't know which way it's going.
Okay, well, look, and we can close out on this. Of course, the place that reports the vote first in the United States, legendarily,
Dixville Notch.
The beautiful small town of Dixville. It's not even a town. There are 6 voters in Dixville Notch.
12 this year.
12? Okay.
Yeah, I think they split, yeah.
I thought it was 3 to 3.
Oh, maybe
it's 6-6? It was either 3 to 3 or 6
multiplying the population.
Anyway,
it's a multiple of 3.
Even Dixville Notch came out 3 to 3, Trump and Harris, while picking Republican gubernatorial candidate and former Senator Kelly Ayotte 5 to 1. So if Dixville Notch is a tiny model of the rest of the United States, we could have Republican overperformance down ballot and this unbelievably razor-thin race at the top.
Could you imagine being the 7th Dixville Notch voter? You would really, the fate of the world might depend on who you choose.
I'm going to
recommend. I don't think they allow by odd numbers of residents in Dixville Notch.
I am going to recommend, before we do our recommendation, I can't really recommend it because you can't find it. I went to look for it last week. There was a movie made in 1939 called The Great Man Votes, written and directed by Garson Kanin, in which John Barrymore plays a man who becomes the deciding vote in a presidential election. It's amazing. It's an amazingly funny, it's really the last great performance by John Barrymore, who was one of the great farceurs and actors of the first half of the 20th century, undone by drink. And there was sort of remade as this terrible movie with Kevin Costner called Swing Vote, like 70 years later. But if for some reason someone can find it somewhere, that's worth watching today if you're looking for something to entertain you. Matt, you have a recommendation that you told me about, and then I will join in on it in a minute.
Yes. Thank you, John. Today I'd like to recommend a new documentary that you can find on the Disney Plus streaming service. It's called Music by John Williams, director Laurent Bouzereau, who is kind of a house historian for Steven Spielberg and George Lucas, the famous filmmakers whose work, of course, depends so much on the cinematic scores and orchestrations written by John Williams. This film is kind of Spielberg's love letter to Williams. He appears throughout it. He clearly had a hand in shaping it because he's a very powerful person. But it is deserved, and I enjoyed it very much. I learned a lot about John Williams. I had not known his background as the son of a Hollywood percussionist, someone who had worked in the big bands in New York and then moved to Hollywood. And so John Williams grew up in this household where, as he says, for every hour he played baseball, he had to do 30 minutes of piano practice, and how he mastered the piano in his youth. I also hadn't known that he had a career as a jazz musician and as kind of side musician, but also that's how he got into basically composing jazz themes and some soundtrack themes for television. And then my final point before I hand it over to you, John, is one theme of the film is the importance of the orchestra, and how when John Williams first began work with Spielberg had loved growing up these big orchestral scores written by composers like Eric Korngold and Max Steiner, the larger than life scores. And at the time in the 70s, everything was kind of trending in a minimalist, kind of jazzy Henry Mancini direction, or kind of, almost atonal kind of sounds
or needle
and films.
drops. Yeah. Needle
songs.
Right. Yeah.
Or actually kind of the music of the time. Like, for example, George Lucas's big blockbuster, American Graffiti. That was all soundtracks, songs recorded in 1962. And so Spielberg came to John Williams for his first major feature, the Sugarland Express, and said, I want you to write a score that like these old scores. And that's how that collaboration began. Of course, the next film they did together was Jaws. And so we get a lot of the story behind the famous chord progression that symbolizes Jaws. And then they talk about the Star Wars score. And again, this was kind of new to me. When they decided to record the Star Wars score with the London Symphony Orchestra, that actually was pretty novel at the time, that you would get one of these big symphony orchestras and John Williams would conduct it. And of course, as the filmmakers say, the score to Star Wars not only is mainly the reason that the film works, I think, it also became a huge phenomenon and a huge bestseller and recording label. Maybe just one more story, John, where they talk about Schindler's List. So in 1993, Spielberg makes both Jurassic Park and Schindler's List back to back. Schindler's List was a very emotional experience for Spielberg. He made the film and cut the film without what's called a temp track. So without any music or score added to it to kind of give the composer, signs of what he's looking for. So it was no music when John Williams saw it. And of course, John Williams was so taken aback by the film that he had to leave after watching it and kind of walk around the studio. And he came back and he said to Steven Spielberg, he said, Steven, this film is so powerful. I can't possibly compose a score. You need a composer of much greater talent than I to write this score for this film. And Spielberg said, according to Williams, John, I know, but they're all dead. So it has to be you. And that, of course, what came out of that was the famous violin theme from Schindler's List.
So Williams has been nominated for 54 Oscars. He's 92 years old.
I think
he was born in 1932, so he's 92 years old.
Yeah.
He was nominated again, like last year, for The Fabelmans. Did not win. Has won 5 Oscars. But just think about that for a minute. He's a guy who writes music. He has been nominated for 54 Oscars. His first Oscar came when he was the orchestrator and arranger and conductor of the movie version of Fiddler on the Roof. But he wrote the theme to Gilligan's Island.
Yeah.
He wrote the music for Lost in Space. He played the piano for what was probably then the most famous TV theme ever recorded, which was the theme to Peter Gunn by Henry Mancini. He was the piano player. He's incredibly fit and in great shape and a great raconteur at 92 in this documentary. He's written concerti. He's written pieces he is an inexhaustible font of musical materials, the Harry Potter themes, Home Alone, obviously all of Spielberg's movies, including Raiders of the Lost Ark, Close Encounters, which of course is entirely based on the idea that the music that he writes is the universal language, E.T., and then the Olympic theme,
right?
The
Meet
NBC
the
nightly,
yeah.
the NBC News theme,
yeah, Sunday Night Football.
There's that's part of, by the way, is that he exposes young people to classical music in
Well,
this way, because I remember being a kid and listening on repeat to the Jurassic Park
right.
Lost World theme song. And so you get other people who otherwise, especially at a young age, would not be exposed to
Well,
classical music.
there is a fascinating point that is made in this, which is that in 1980 he becomes the he becomes the conductor of the Boston Pops. They don't really explain why that was a big thing. The Boston Pops was was what you called the Boston Symphony Orchestra when it played non-classical music, and it was on PBS. There was a Boston Pops series every year on PBS, and it was the most watched, most listened to orchestral music in the United States, had been for 40 years. There was a guy named Arthur Fiedler who had conducted the Boston Pops. And John Williams, therefore, was like a big thing that he became the conductor of the Boston Pops. And the Boston Pops, who were the Boston Symphony Orchestra, were offended and disgusted by the fact that he was a movie composer and wanted to play movie scores. And they were rude and surly and unpleasant to him. And he quit. He quit. He said, "You all stink. I don't like the way you behave toward me. I don't have time for this." And he quit. And the Boston Symphony Orchestra, Seiji Ozawa, sort of crawled back to him and kind of got him to come back.
Well, the dirty secret of these classical orchestras is that Pops concerts and Nutcracker concerts are what keep them afloat. These are the
right.
most
But
popular
in 1980, if you were a classical musician, you were a keeper of the flame of high culture. And this was poison. You were being poisoned by this cheap, tawdry, fake classical music that was being played, in the cinema and all of that. And then he comes in and he's restored as the conductor of the Boston Pops. At which point it was that at this point that those Pops things and having people come and play Star Wars in your symphony orchestra or in your concert hall became the moneymaker that it did. But I think that's a very interesting. And then all these people, Annie Sophie Mutter, the great violinist, Yo-Yo Ma, Itzhak Perlman, Gustavo Dudamel, all of these, the greatest classical musicians of our age, say he helped save classical music. The sound of classical music has been saved by John Williams, who kept it alive in the movies. Now, this is like one of those questions. It's like, is it better for kids to read a garbage novel? Like you want your kid to read Stendhal, but if your kid reads Elmore Leonard, does that mean that your kid is somehow being diseased by reading Elmore Leonard when he could be reading Stendhal?
And Williams, I think it's not quite the like high-low culture. I know that's the way maybe symphony musicians.
Well, that's what they felt like in the early 80s.
They were
that's
wrong and
Yeah.
presumptuous. I mean, the man's clearly a genius.
He is a genius,
an American original. Yeah. And I think it's Seth MacFarlane of all people who in the documentary says, 60 years from now, 80 years from now, if they hold these symphony concerts, it will be Beethoven, Mozart, Bach, and Williams. And I think there's something to that. I mean, I think the melodies that he's come up with over his career are going to stay, even separated from the films that, of course, which are enlivened by them and which kind of create these memories for so many people in the audience.
But I mean, it's just when you watch it, your jaw just starts to drop at just what he produced. Like you can't believe. And this 1-2 step in 1993, which is also Spielberg's great, that was like Spielberg's great, I am the greatest ever, don't even try to come near me, right? Which was Jurassic Park, the most successful movie ever made, and Schindler's List, the most powerful movie ever made. And one, he wins the Oscar. One is the greatest special effects picture of all time. And Williams writes an indelible score for Jurassic Park and then sits down at a piano and writes this theme to Schindler's List that is deathless, the way the Pachelbel's Kanon or something like that is deathless, in the same year, just like he wrote Star Wars and Close Encounters in the same year. The mind reels. Like, as I think Seth MacFarlane said, maybe just somebody said, any one of these 60 scores for any other film composer would be the greatest achievement of their career. And he wrote 60 of them. And so it's just a singular story. It's just so like,
it's fun to watch.
The story of of like an American genius of a very fine hued vintage. Anyway, that's directed by John Williams on
music by
Disney
John
Plus.
Williams.
Music by John Williams.
Of course, all the music in the film is by John Williams.
Yes.
Well, with the exception of some Henry Mancini.
Exactly. Okay, so enjoy Election Day. We'll be back tomorrow morning to deal with the wreckage. maybe the wreckage. Maybe we'll be clearing the wreckage. Maybe we'll be hip deep in the wreckage, but we will be back tomorrow morning, and wreckage will be part of our subject. So, with that, for Matt and Seth and Christine and Abe and the last 4 years, I'm John Podhoretz. Keep the candle burning.